Thank you so much for finding time to be in conversation with us today. You're more than welcome to use the chat and the question and answer function. It's great to see everybody putting in the country that you're calling in from in the chat already. This is going to be a great session. So let's get into this. So the first thing that I would like to do, like we start a lot of our gatherings here in this continent down in Australia, is I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're calling in from. A lot of you are already doing that in the chat. Thank you so much. It's great to see people from all over the world. I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and extend this respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people with us today. It means a lot to me to be calling in from unceded Wurundjeri country as a visitor in this place. And especially when we talk about things like social imagination, it feels so important to take a moment and recognize that there's about 65,000 years of imagining and dreaming and learning and making and systems thinking, and this could go on. And it's the longest continuous living culture on Earth. And it continues today. So I would invite you in whatever way feels right for you, wherever you are, to take a moment and feel into what it means for you to pay respect to and acknowledge country, all of the lives and the stories and the wisdoms that always have been, always will be. As you will have read in the event invitations, we're hosting this series because we believe that as we grapple with past events and ongoing harm, and we try to work towards more just and equitable futures, we need to find ways to move beyond sort of piecemeal reform, and we need to create spaces to imagine together how things could be radically different and better. And our use of the word radical here is not Californian inspired. It's a very intentional choice because the word radical actually comes from this Latin word radix, meaning roots. And in its earliest uses, yes, radical, like radical dude, but also radical meaning roots. So in its earliest use, radical referred to something that was fundamental or at the root of something else. And over time, it evolved to describe individuals or ideas that are seeking like fundamentally or extreme changes in society or politics. But we use it here to describe social imagination in a much more gentle and grounded way. So my friend Kira Cowther says imagination is like the soil that our ideas can grow in. So then, social imagination asks us whose ideas can thrive in the current environment, and how can we collectively cultivate our soil for new ideas and how we might be together. So if you still feel like you don't get it, that's okay. That is why we have invited two absolutely brilliant thinkers and speakers and practitioners to take us through some concrete examples of the work that they've been doing. So without too much more preamble, one quick note on housekeeping. As you'll see, this is being recorded, and the recording is going to be sent out to everyone who is registered, along with the link to register for our second conversation coming up early next month. It's always nice to see who's out there and what's going on, so please feel free. You're welcome to use the chat. Any resources that are shared in the chat will consolidate and send that back out in a return email. And we aren't going to have any scheduled breaks in this next 90 minutes, so please take care of your body, take care of yourself out there, do what you need to do. We'll have one section towards the very end where we invite you to use the chat and to type some responses into the chat towards the end. So you might want to return to your keyboards around that time. Um, I'll just briefly introduce myself and hand it over to Perry, and then we'll hear from Hannah and Ruth. So I am Ali Edwards. I'm a senior program manager with the not-for-profit Center for Public Impact, and we work globally to reimagine government so that it works better for everyone. And in the team at ANZ, that means that we help teams within government to learn to like think systemically more, to embrace complexity, to think about how they're building meaningful relationships, and to really kind of continuously learn and adapt alongside the people that our public servants are serving. We're co-hosting this three-part speaker series with Perry from Third Story. And with that, I might pass it over to you, Perry.
Thank you so much, Ali, and welcome everyone. It's so nice to see all of you on this evening and this morning and all the other time zones that you're calling in from. My name's Perry I'm director at an organisation called Third Story. You might have known us as Innovation Unit Australia and New Zealand. That used to be our name until reasonably recently. And we are an organisation that works internationally and locally to imagine new possibilities and build conditions for social impact at scale. And that normally means that we're working with government, communities, services, other partners, and supporting collaboration on priorities that matter to them. And so CPI and Third Story have been engaged in this interest in social imagination together for a while. This speaker series has been a little while in the making. And we were drawn together really because of a shared interest in the disciplines and the practices that help us to imagine and move towards better futures. And, we know from our work how hard it can be to create space for really understanding a challenge, sharing different perspectives, going into new possibilities and testing them out with the depth and the detail that is actually required to do a better thing. And so for all these reasons, and because we were interested in what colleagues were doing around the world around these challenges, we wanted to pull together this speaker series. And our interest really has been to support relationship building. We know a lot of people engaged here today will be working on similar and related challenges. So learning from one another has been a goal. We really recognise not everyone will be familiar with this term of social imagination. So our starting point today, and it doesn't have to be called that, we've already had a conversation about different ways that we refer to these things. But this is a term that people are using to describe different kinds of ways of working. So we're going to start today with something quite introductory, but grounded in practice. It's about understanding how people are actually doing the work. And through this series, that's what you'll see. We'll send out some more detail about the other two sessions that are happening in June and July. But the kinds of questions that will come through them are, what's social imagination? Why does it matter? What value might it be bringing? And how do we fund and commission for imagination? These are not straightforward questions. So we're really looking forward to digging into those with practitioners who are based here in Australia and other parts of the world. So hope you'll come back and join us for other sessions too. I now have the great pleasure of introducing Ruth Kennedy and Hannah McDowall. I'm going to read a little bit of an intro about Ruth for those of you that don't know her. Ruth is the founder, director of an organisation called the Public Office in the UK. And Ruth has tried to change the world from a range of vantage points. I love this. This is great. Through educating young people, international development, and working at the heart of the UK government. Building on these experiences, Ruth has spent the past 16 years delighting in creating spaces in which colleagues from a range of disciplines can work collaboratively to cause creative and generative disruption to systems that are stuck. So Ruth loves people and learning, and she believes wherever possible, work should be fun. We welcome you, Ruth. We're so glad you're here. And I'm going to pass over to Ali to welcome Hannah.
Thanks so much, Perry. So for those of you who don't know Hannah McDowall, Hannah is the director of Canopy, a social imagination project. She's based in the UK and started out as an ecologist, where she learned that the wild world did not matter to global capital. Dazed and disheartened, she moved into participatory development and women's labor rights organizing, where she got stuck in a beautifully instructive academic whirlpool for a bit. It was 15 years ago that she found her feet again as a mythologist and a storyteller, which is core to her imagination practice. Through her organization, Canopy, she works with local government and communities to imagine new futures. And just what that looks like is what we are here to talk about today. So without any further ado, Hannah and Ruth, can I hand it over to you?
Thank you, Ali and Perry. Ruth, isn't it weird to have someone read out who you are?
Luckily
Weird
for
and
me,
wonderful.
that's the moment that my Wi-Fi went really loopy, so I missed it all. But
Oh,
I'm now on 5G, so hopefully steady.
wonderful. Now, I feel like we've been invited here to give you a grounding in social imagination, and that's a little bit scary because it's sort of impossible. And it's impossible because this is such an emergent area of thinking, and it's a philosophy as much as it is a methodology. And even yesterday, when Ruth and I met just to do a few little fine tweaks of what we were going to bring to you, we ended up having a 2-hour conversation about what is social imagination. So today, we invite you to that conversation, really, to the edge of practice. We invite you to be befuddled to some degree, which we are too. It's the right way to be with this topic. And in a sense, what we want to offer is like, I mean, you're at 4 p.m, most of you in Australia, which means you're just coming up towards beer o'clock, whether that's alcoholic or non-alcoholic, depending on your preference. But I think what we might be able to do is just flip the cap on the bottle. And, you know, over the next days and weeks and years, you will be pouring out the contents of that and exploring it yourselves. So we're at half past 7:45 now in the morning. So maybe not so much beer for us, but that's what we're hoping to do. So I'm going to start just by giving us a bit of an introduction to that sort of philosophical standpoint of social imagination. Why do we need it? What does it mean? Why do we need it? And then we're going to move on to some chunky examples that are going to hopefully be quite grounding. So we are in, I'm sure we all agree, a depleting polycrisis. And this is not the inevitable outcome of progress and population growth. It's a result of a load of actions which arise out of a set of beliefs and values that have been imagined. Those beliefs and values are like that soil that Kira was referring to. They've been imagined, and they've been imagined by some of my immediate ancestors, the colonists and the industrialists of the global north. Social imagination says our present and our future could and must be imagined otherwise, starting from a different set of worldviews and values, many of which we've already acknowledged at the very beginning of this session. And so that's the kind of foundation. So Ruth and I, we've been working government and not-for-profit for many years, and we see leaders with a genuine desire to change what's happening for the better, to make the world fairer and more sustainable. And these ambitious visions are often put out there like a shining kind of beacon at the top of a hill, which we see progressively rolls back down the hill to end up being something really quite similar to what was already happening. So why is this? We would say that it's because we use our established ways of problem solving, our established ways of seeing, being and doing, what I might call our established imaginary, to fix it. And of course, we end up coming up with similar solutions to the ones we had last time, because we're privileging the same kinds of ways of knowing again and again. And our modern way of doing this is utterly saturated with those values I referred to from the Industrial Revolution, engineer it better, and from survival of the fittest. You know, there's a bumper sticker in the US which says, "The one who has the most number of toys when he dies wins." And, you know, we could see, oh my goodness, that imaginary is actually so deeply in our culture. It's so deeply in me, you know. And actually the people who are least powerful in our culture, the ones who are marginalized, they don't necessarily dream from that place. They dream from a different place. The reason their way of dreaming, their imaginary, is marginalized is because it threatens that established modern way of thinking. So social imagination says, if we really want to change the world for the better, we need to welcome those ways of knowing back in. Stop exiling them because they threaten us. And right now in our global context, we see that so much, a strengthening of the position of the industrialist and the global north as a power base and productivity. It's kind of being hotly defended at the moment, and that gives us a clue that it's being eroded, and it inevitably will be. So I wanted to kind of introduce that philosophical stance. It's decolonial. It's saying who gets to imagine the future matters. And in our practice of social imagination, we want to put different ways of imagining the future in the center, and be deeply aware of how the ways that we've inherited carry the same old ways of thinking that might keep us in the same old scrape. I hope that makes sense. All right, I've got a few slides to share with you now. Let's see if we can manage that, shall we? We're going to get onto the examples soon. Don't worry. Right. That's the philosophical bit done. Let me see. Share. Here we go. Share. All good. Slideshow. Here we are. All right. So this just simply says really what I've just been saying about staying stuck. So social imagination is a way of understanding the world and a way of working that supports us to collectively imagine and build the future that we want. And we use this metaphor of a forest to describe this. It's transforming because it reveals and helps us act on the underlying imaginaries that hold us stuck. So a lot of our work, we are trying to reveal these constraining imaginaries to leaders, and in a sense reduce their confidence in their expertise and their usefulness, those imaginaries. And we are trying to sort of reveal and boost the imaginaries of communities that are marginalized and increase their confidence that how they see the world has got a lot to say about what we should do next. So imagination uses creative practice that draws on our sensation ways of knowing, on our feeling ways of knowing, on our relationships, rather than in this cognitive, linear, problem-solving way of knowing. For that reason, it is inclusive and equalizing, because we can all come to that table. Social imagination is generative. As we work on revealing that soil, we can enrich it with new ways of imagining. And that, of course, can support more. We know from a forest that the more diverse the soil is, the more diversity it can welcome. It has a sort of ongoingly generative and regenerative effect. It's absolutely the opposite of a sense of sort of scarcity and, you know, the winner takes all. So one of the other ways of thinking about this that we often bring when we're thinking, what does it mean to lift the lid on our imaginary of how we think change can happen? What does it mean to lift that bonnet, so to speak, and look at the engine? Is that it's not just about our thinking and our doing, it's also very much about our being. We need to attend to all of these. We need to attend to what we do, yes, but also what are those attitudes and beliefs that are driving our doing? What are those ways of relating to one another and to our creativity, our being, that enables new ways of doing and seeing to happen? So all the time we need to attend to all three of these, not just our doing, which is a very modern way of responding to things. All right, phew, that's the philosophy done. Let's hear a couple of examples. So I'm going to share with you briefly 2 examples of work in the last couple of years that I've done, which have had a very explicit social imagination framing. So the first one is called the Household Model of Health. This was in London, and there's a part of London which has a very high Portuguese-speaking community. It's in the south of London, in Stockwell, very high proportion, and they have very poor health outcomes compared to everybody else. And we know why this is. It's the social determinants of health. It's poor income, it's low language skills, so inability to navigate the economy differently. It's poor transport links. It's most of these people came over in the 70s, and they came from farming communities and ate the kind of food that works if you are living that kind of a very physical life. Bringing that food to this country and that culture to this country when maybe you're not burning off a load of calories and salt every day in the sun farming causes health problems. So we know what the problem is in theory, but the medical community, this is an example of a shop in that area. The medical community, it's imaginary. You can see on the left here, it's spreadsheets and it's individual advice, and it's get your blood pressure down. It's come to a mass clinic on diabetes. None of it's working. So in our project, we worked with a range of community stakeholders, from not-for-profits, from the local health sector, and you can see our meeting on the right here. We have some very unhealthy cheese. Oh, we've got a bottle of wine, some sparkling water, definitely some porky bits, and I can tell you there'll be some pastel de nata somewhere. Bringing in the Portuguese culture into how we were running, even conceptualizing the problem, was really important. So this team are not all health workers, they're community workers. And we worked with 15 families to imagine what health would be like, because nobody wants to be ill. And you can see here's an imagination practice. Oh yeah, more pork and butter. And on this table, we've got some photos where we've invited them to answer questions about health through using these images. What does health mean to you? Might have been the question we looked at here. And this is happening in a community centre. So instead of being in the imaginary of the medical space, we're in the imaginary of the community. How do they make sense of the world? This is a board game we created for families that worked with us. And we were thinking about household health because they have huge amounts of loyalty to one another. So if they don't want to act on individual expertise about their health, what kind of potential can the family, the household unlock? So here's a board game where people are dreaming into their healthy futures. That's them playing it in a doctor's surgery. They planted some seeds to imagine what healthy behaviours they would like to grow for one another. This is one family. We've got Anna on the right, and you can't see it. On the left, we've got George. And they talked about their health priorities and how they would support each other's health priorities, health and well-being. We ran community events where people could talk about these things and support one another together. This was some storytelling around a fire. And in the end, we created a kind of community coaching model where families could coach one another and get support from us in the health outcomes they really cared about. And we saw amazing outcomes. Here's one family. On the right, we have Miguel. On the left, we have Ellen and their son, Michael, in the middle. Miguel was experiencing serious mental health problems and not taking his medication that was disrupting the family as a whole. And Ellen on the left, and the whole family went through a kind of process of looking at what their priorities were. And the behaviour in the family massively changed as they were all able to support Miguel's health and Ellen's health and Michael's health. And so we saw the whole family transform its health. And we saw this again and again across the cohort. And it became a project which was then scaled in that community. So I hope that gives an example of how we put the priorities and the imaginary and the ways of being, seeing and doing together of the community at the centre of how we design the way we do health, rather than asking them to think the way the medical system thinks, which is a different way. That's my first example. Another really quick one from last summer. This was in Wales. It's called Imagining the Future. That's how you say imagining the future in Welsh. It's much better than imagining the future in English. And we were working in two ex-slate mine valleys. So these are towns in which there's been a real industrial story, but that story's come to an end because the slate is no longer mined in that way. But these towns have been built, these people are here. What's the economic future of them? And the problem being that young people are not staying. They just want to leave because they can't see a future for themselves, which also leads to all kinds of drug problems and alcohol problems in these communities. And so we gathered the kind of local infrastructure, which included local government, also national government in Wales, and the local kind of not-for-profit sector, who desperately want to say, how can we reshape our valleys, our economy to include young people so they want to stay? So we gathered them to say, if you really want to do this, you need to put the imaginations of these young people at the centre. And they said, all right then, you go away and do that, and we promise we'll listen. Which they did, which is great. So what did we do? So we worked with these groups of young people in these two valleys, and we started by creating places they could imagine in that were outside of the current story, because they have a very negative set of ideas about their place. There's nothing for us, nobody listens to us, there's no point in staying, no one really cares what we do. And so to disrupt that, we sometimes need to offer a different place to imagine in. So I brought a traditional story from Kazakhstan. That's me telling the story. I don't know what bit of the story that was, but a traditional story in Kazakhstan, which is about sort of young people leading transformational change in a valley. And they started by imagining into that space before we invited them to imagine their valley. So they kind of dress rehearsed it and loosened up their imaginations in this other place where they don't have all these limiting beliefs about it. We played these embodied games, which explored the principles we wanted to explore as a group. So this is a game in which we imagine we have these golden threads between each other and thinking about the social connections we have in a community. These were 15 and 16-year-olds. And we imagined through our hands. This was the question we looked at. Imagine your valley 10 years from now as a place you can flourish, a place you want to stay. So on the left, we have one valley, that was Bethesda. You can see a massive snowman in the middle there. And on the right, we have Blaenau Festiniog. They were modelling in Lego, and in the left was in sort of plasticine. So these two valleys, but they're alongside one another. And they did this in about 20 minutes, and they're modelling onto the shape of a map. You can't really see the map drawn there, but there's a map underneath what they're doing. There you go, that's Bethesda, that's Blaenau. And then we moved on for them to imagine what would their role be in that future if they hung around in it. You know, what would it be for you to really have skin in the game of this future? We asked an artist to take those maps and to create something beautiful and visual from them that we could use as a gathering point. So an artist took images of the bits of the map and annotated it with all the things they'd spoken about. So that's Bethesda, and this is Blaenau Festiniog. There's a beautiful quote here at the bottom right hand. It's better to have one or two big things than lots of little things that don't last. Yeah, that's one of the things the young people said. Then we held these community meetings with the local authorities and the local charities, infrastructure, and in the middle of the conversations were those maps. And you can see there are these local people that hold power alongside the young people, and the young people presented their maps. And it was amazing to see them step into this beautiful space of agency when their way of imagining was at the centre. They didn't want to do it at first. None of these were particularly politicised young people. They were like, oh, we'll come along and make tea and coffee, but we're not going to say anything. But then when they saw their maps and they saw these people, they were like, yeah, no, we're going to do this. And they stepped up and they sat down and they said, this is what we need. And as they spoke, these power holders were able to reflect and say, we haven't been listening. We know you want a space for a space to hang out, but we didn't know you wanted it to be like this. And we need to change our way of thinking so that it's how you want it to be. We didn't realise transport was so important, that for you to stay, we need to allow you to leave and come back again. And when the transport's appalling, you won't stay. We didn't realise that all the rugby clubs are set up for boys and there's none for girls. We need to change it, and stuff is really changing as a result. So that's my, oh, this was it happening in Blaenau as well as in Bethesda. So that's my two little examples. I'm going to hand over to Ruth now, who's going to give us a chunkier example of a piece of work that we both worked on together. So this was one we designed and delivered together. And just to let you know, I'm on slides and Ruth's on trying to make me change the slides. So we'll hope that's going to work.
Without saying next slide, please, every 5 words.
Yeah.
Hannah, thanks so much. So this last example, which is a little bit chunkier, slightly comes at it from a slightly different angle, in that what we're going to try and reveal is a bit more of the experience of the doing from the organizations that were involved, as opposed to the experience of the community participants. So just go back one slide, give us that view again of Canby, just to tell you where Canby Island is. So Canby Island is an island that is only an island at high tide, and it sits on the south side of Essex, which is a county to the northeast of London. And Canby, when the tide comes in twice a day, has this very strong island mentality. There's a wonderful sense of independence, and it's quite an iconic community. It is one of those places that is always near the top of the list when people are throwing money at the forgotten places, the behind places. So some of the wards on the island are in the 10% most deprived in the country. Only about 50% of the young people on the island reach the expected standards for English and maths. So you get the sense. There are some very wealthy parts, but there is a lot of very entrenched deprivation. And but it's also this fantastic place that people go for holidays and having fun. And we were invited in by a fabulous practitioner at Essex County Council, with whom we had done work over a number of years. Perry was involved in lots of that work, and she had experienced innovative and disruptive approaches to change making. And she'd been asked to be what was called the Levelling Up Director for Canby. This was a national government initiative, which was supposed to be about developing some of those places outside of London that had been left behind. But what happened, I think it's fair to say, in England, was that these levelling up projects became big top-down, someone at the centre decides sort of infrastructure projects. And Claire, the key colleague at Essex County Council, was super smart, because she knew that would have no impact whatsoever on Canby, this place that has had a myriad of initiatives, shed loads of money over the years, and broadly nothing has ever changed. And we received a wonderful invitation from her, which was broadly, we need to do something different, and it has to be about working with the people from their perspectives. So she didn't say, can we have a social imagination project? But the invitation was, can we change how we do this piece of work? Keep going, Hannah. So we started from where they were at. It wasn't a blank sheet of paper. The colleagues from the county council and elsewhere had already brought together a whole heap of people who might have an interest, from government agencies, from the voluntary sector, faith sector, and so on. They'd had a great big meeting. People had got excited, and at the end of that meeting, an invitation had been offered by Claire, who would like to do something together that we can't describe what it is. We don't know what it's going to do, but it's definitely going to be different. And out of that came what became what we called our core leadership team. So it was completely self-selecting group of people, and it was the council, there was the local priest, there was the youth sector, there was someone from the food bank, the local primary school, etc., etc. And they were just a group of people who wanted to go on a journey together and do it differently. So it made for a very different start point that we were able to capitalize on. Next one, Hannah. So the key thing we were really clear about and were able to be explicit about upfront was that this was going to be different. And Claire helpfully used the language of emergence. She readied people for the fact that we were going to sort of make this thing up as we went along, which was hugely permissive. And by deliberately adopting different ways of working, we immediately created some confidence that at least we weren't going to end up where we always end up, in the place that doesn't do anything different. We gave people a small amount of information up front. This slide reflects how we described right at the end to colleagues at what we were doing. We were not very explicit up front about social imagination as a practice. We did talk about the fact that we were going to need to see the world differently, and that meant seeing with and through the eyes of the residents of Canby. We were really clear that we were going to be differently together, and this was a new invitation to get involved in something that hadn't happened before, and that this would lead to different doing. But apart from that, people didn't really know what was going on at all. Next one. So it was really important that we started by tuning in to our key self-selecting colleagues. And this meant actually asking them questions that help them to explore their own relationship to the place, their relationship to one another, and their relationship to previous efforts of change making, all of which ran some interference on the imaginaries that they were holding on to, that they had been allowed or given permission to work with in the past. And then we connected them to each other as we explored what they had said about how they felt about the place. Canby has this very strong sense of identity. So people from outside talk about it very negatively. And that creates a response with the people on the island, that they talk about it very positively. They talk about the community, the love for the place, the fact that people support each other. And they needed some support to bring those very strong, important feelings together with some reality about what's going on, that their young people are not achieving as they should achieve, that they're not going to the places that they want to go to. And we created a space in which those early, very honest conversations were shared with the team. And they'd never had those conversations together. Health people, council people, voluntary sector, faith people, local community people, they'd not had those conversations. So having connected us all together, we brought people together in a wonderful youth club called Yellow Door for some foundational work. And that meant connecting to what we think are two really important, equally important kind of facets of social imagination practice. When you're doing social imagination, it has to be both an internal and you also have to work together on the connected sense of what are we here for? Who are we here for? How are we here? And we invited people to participate in a really simple exercise. We asked them to imagine themselves at 17. Where were they? What were they doing? What was important to them? That topic was chosen because our client had asked us to focus this work in on the outcomes for children and young people. And in connecting with themselves in a reflective way, people revealed the wildness of their journeys from 17 to, adult professional lives. Nearly everybody in the room had gone off in all sorts of interesting and unpredictable directions, but had come to great places. And it brought in a sense of new hope, I think, and possibility, which created some interesting foundations for imagining differently together with the people of Canby. And then we connected in using constellations work in an exercise about where have we been in relation to each other. And all of these organisations all have been working very hard for a long time on Canby, but all facing in different directions from each other, and practically nobody really facing into and lifting up the voices of the people of the island. And so they started to imagine, what if we orientated ourselves differently to this task? So the final thing we did on that foundational day, again, beautifully simple exercise, but we talked about the fact that whatever this journey was that we were on, it was going to be a relational, networked effort, and therefore inviting more and more people who might have a part to play or might want to play a part in was going to be key. And how are we going to do that? And we recognise that the traditional paradigm, the traditional imaginary says the way to ask people to be involved is you send them an email or you tell them you've appointed them to the programme board. And we invited people to think about a beautiful invitation that they had received at some point in the past. And they thought about what that was like and what that had made them feel. And we took that thinking into, so what does that mean for how we might be and conduct ourselves in this work together? Again, it's really simple, but creating a very different platform for the work. So having done that foundational work, the next piece of the programme was to start to get close to the community and to listen. And I mean, this was very simple. We did it in two ways. First of all, we had a period of time where all the expectation was that all of our core leadership team would go out and listen to some people on Canopy, whether it was people that they work with, people that they live alongside, people they bump into in the street. And we, as a team, we had a small team as well. We also went and spent a couple of days on the island. And these were very informal, ad hoc, on the street conversations with people. So we're talking dozens of conversations, not hundreds. And that enabled us to hear and surface some of the opinions and thoughts that are floating around the island. There were snippets of stories about ill health, evictions, children, families, older generation, so on and so forth. And we came back together as a team to a day which was making sense of these little snippets. And what was wonderful was that because everybody had done some listening, everyone had something to contribute. And we mapped that in a shared sense-making exercise that tuned us into the voices of people and the commonalities and the themes that were coming through. And it started to beg more questions. And what people realised was, well, we've got the snippets, but what lies underneath? And so the second phase of this was some deeper ethnographic listening. And we framed quite carefully the sorts of people we were hoping to listen to, and had 4 people from the community that we engaged with really deeply, and 4 practitioners, people who had been working for the youth club, for the local health service, and so on. People who've been working closely with the community to understand how things had looked and felt and what the change-making efforts had been before and where maybe there were opportunities for different. We're just introducing you to one. This is Brodie, who's 16 and had so much to offer and so many imaginaries for the future of Canvey in his own life. Very clear that, you know, none of you will be surprised that the clarity of the observations, just like the young people Hannah was working with in Wales, was just so profound. So having done that deep listening, we then brought that back together and were able to process that. And we just want to say very quickly that it would be easy to think that this is sort of similar to kind of co-design type work. And I think one of the most profound things to realize, and it goes back to Hannah's very careful setting out of the philosophy here, that this is very different to traditional co-design, co-production methodologies mapped onto the traditional ways of working. This is about totally disrupting whose voices matter, who gets to imagine, and how we respond. So it really is quite different to those practices. Bringing us into land, the final phase of our project was to have a big, more expansive call to action workshop day, which happened at this place. And I'm just going to briefly explain why it's important. It was due to happen at the leisure centre. And at the last minute, the project team muscled in to say we need to do it at the Paddocks. This is a condemned building, which had been sort of taken out of the community's use for a whole heap of reasons. And we held our event here. I don't quite know how they got permission to do it. It was freezing cold. It was November. I don't think there was any heating. The lights at one end of the room didn't work. But it was so important to be in the space that they felt belonged to them. And we brought people together, next one, Hannah, to participate in a collective reflection on the years of all the money being chucked at this place and nothing really changing. One of our participants in this workshop said, "We've been doing the same thing for 20 years. It's like rinse and repeat." And it was a very powerful moment where this much bigger group of people was stepping into a shared collective ambition to imagine differently together. And our core leadership team played a leadership role in that. New people, we had about 60 odd people in this workshop. Our core leadership team was about 15. They played a role in sort of briefing wider colleagues into this new way of seeing the world, new way of being together, and then leading to new ideas for how we might do differently. And that leadership that they play to sort of widening the numbers of participants in this work was really important. And next one, it was really clear that this was a learning thing. And I think we managed to, with the help of our colleagues, create an environment in which it was okay to challenge everything and to do that honestly together. And people were beginning to be different. They were creating different soil together, in which something new could grow. So we centered the voices of people that we listened to. We used audio, photos. We read the stories that people had agreed that reflected what they'd said and what they were imagining and hoping for. And then the final stage of the day was that led to a number of groups coming together to think about their seeing, being and doing together. It was only at this stage that we really gave them some language around social imagination and how this was a very different paradigm. And as the hope in the room kind of expanded, the final bit was that people identified a number of key pieces of work that they had real ownership and energy for in the room. And that was the point at which we left them. What was interesting to finish on is that the description on this, the metaphor that you've already seen, was how our client understood the journey that we had been on together. And for her, the key success criteria, the key outcome was that we left all the participants changed as individuals and their relationship to the place and their doing, as a connected relational community, and as a new kind of like a sort of composted soil ready to keep moving forward from this point onwards. Hannah, do you want to?
Well, that is all of what we wanted to share as kind of examples and to kind of get the ball rolling. But really now we'd like to open up to Ali and Perry for sort of questions and the rest and the wider community.
Thank you so much. Sorry, Perry.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to? Yeah. Thank you. Someone needs to take a look at the chat. There's an incredible amount of dialogue and engagement in the chat. But before we go to questions, I just want to thank you for revealing your practice in such a detailed and helpful way. We don't often get the opportunity to really lift the bonnet on other people's ways of working and ways of thinking in work. And I think you've done such a magical job of that here. And the questions that are coming through in the chat are so deeply about practice, actually. And they're just to call out one that jumped out, and I think Emma said Jade Tang Taylor did an awesome job of paraphrasing some of the other things that were going on in the conversation. So maybe one thing we want to do is scroll back up, Ali, and come to that question. But there are a lot of questions about, is this new? How new is it? What's distinctive about social imagination? And how does it relate to other practices such as co-design or asset-based community development? What are your reflections on that? And there was a slight moment of controversy around your reflections on co-design also in the chat. So maybe just, a question about methods and how you combine them and how you see some of the distinctions. Are they even helpful?
Shall I start, Ruth? Well, actually, my colleague Jake at Canopy and we've written a whole exceptionally long paper on this, which is what we call it collective imagination in that one. What is collective imagination and how is it different, including to different ways of doing things? I think, first of all, I think quite possibly I'm really up for being challenged that it's not different, if you see what I mean. I don't want to stand and say it's definitely different if maybe it's not. Maybe my understanding of these things is limited in some ways or culturally framed. But I think the core difference is that I suppose social imagination or collective imagination uses a co-design, co-production approach, but what is different is that it is going, hang on a minute, what are the assumptions in the room that are shaping how we are allowed to imagine or dream in the first place? How does the structures of who's setting up the opportunity already shape what people consciously, semi-consciously, unconsciously believe is possible for them to be dreaming into? And again, Ruth and I have done another project in Norfolk where they were working with the disabled community and they had a very good story about co-production. But when we really sat with those people in the disabled community, they would say, they invite us to meetings and it's too short, their agendas are too long, it's supposed to be co-production, but we can't move at that speed and we don't want to move at that speed. And actually, we don't feel that they really listen to the world we're talking about. And that's because although they're using the word co-production and they're having a meeting in the diary that's called co-production, and they invite the right people, the way they haven't actually done the inner work of going, am I really willing to let go of my expertise as a leader and be willing to be the learner and to really listen to how other people's worlds is not the one I'm comfortable in? That bit hasn't happened. What's happened is some doing on the surface where we set up a meeting, maybe we use some exercises that in principle should work, but actually, if we still believe we're the expert and the power holder, it has a limited effect. I don't know if that helps to answer.
I just pick up on that. To add to that, I think it's the philosophical question at the heart: who gets to imagine the future matters. And I think the best of co-production work looks really similar, but the major limitations on co-production and co-design practice is the paradigm into which it happens. And I think the existing system has got very, very good at saying the right things and even creating a small amount of space in which some really profound practice can happen, but absolutely making sure that it doesn't touch or disrupt the major scaffolding in which this whole thing happens. And we've seen that lots. And like the worst expression of it, I think Perry and I saw, was when a bit of local government had a consultation policy, which they just crossed out consultation and did a word change and changed all the consultations for co-production and assumed that that was I know, I'm sure no one on this call would see that as co-production, but the understanding is so poor about the power situation. And I think what I found really helpful is that the philosophy and practice of social imagination really allows much, much, much greater interference and disruption to those assumptions and beliefs.
And I think the other thing, looking just looked at the chat, some folks have sort of talked, like mentioned the double diamond. Service design and co-design aren't quite the same thing, but the service design world, which also relates to this, really sees people foundationally as consumers. That's basically underneath. That's its philosophy, is that communities, that people are consumers, and we work with people as they are consumers, and rather than they are world makers and dreamers and imaginers. It is a different start point.
Can I just pick up on another strand of conversation that's happening in the chat? It's really clear that you, as practitioners, have a talent or great expertise at building trust, especially in those who are kind of commissioning work such as this. So what I'd love to understand is something about how you're creating those conditions of trust in projects so that, those folks that are commissioning you are taking allowing a huge risk to happen of imagining something very uncertain that they can't project plan for. So how are you allowing everybody to get into that adaptive space? And I guess there was another question which was about, how do you know people have changed? So what is it? How do you know that you're actually shifting from one place to another through that too?
If I answer the second question, perhaps with a little snippet from Canvey. So I think the simplest way in which we knew that people had changed, we began, I'm trying to remember when we began the work. I think it was like early summer, maybe May, June. And in the early months, questions were being asked about how many families are going to have been impacted by this work by October. Those sorts of outputs were expected. And 6 months later, the key leaders from key organizations they were saying it really doesn't matter if we don't have a new project up and going affecting X families. The fact is, we are all the different institutions, and effectively all the money running through these institutions are now in relationship to the place and in relationship to each other in a totally different way. So their concept of what success would be had totally changed.
I think the only thing I would add to that is that really, I'm sure many of you who are practitioners in all of these related fields know that over time, when you build up trust with a client or a partner, you're able to do more. So it is not at all insignificant that Ruth had been working with Essex for a long time, and that there was that deep trust to say, okay, we're going to give you some money, and you said you don't know what you're going to do. All right, we're good with that. That doesn't happen off the bat. So that kind of long-term social imagination work is best when it's long term. because it's this business of the soil developing more trust and belief in what's imaginable, and then growing something new, and that then enriches the soil again, and then growing something new, and that enriches the soil again. So it definitely, the kind of long-term trajectory is really important.
Maybe it's helpful just to say that I explained very quickly at the beginning that the Canvey Island piece of work began as this sort of levelling up thing. One of the things that happened at the end was that the place put in a successful application to central government for, I think it was £20 million, wasn't it, Hannah?
Yeah.
And they had, and this is where the worlds collide, don't they? Because you know, it's not like we've got perfect social imagination world over here and then big bad all the other stuff over here. We're trying to grow and move together, and what the colleagues who've been involved in the social imagination work did was they brought that into what they said to central government that they wanted to do and how they would do it. And that was a really profound change. I think before that, what they would have been pitching for would have been very different. So that doesn't mean everything's changed at all, but it's starting to shift. The soil has been composted to be a bit different, a bit better. The voices of people and their imaginaries much more central. So it's a developmental thing over time, but it started and it hadn't started before.
And I think there's something about this composting metaphor and how we tend to the soil that's really resonating with me, because it's not like a one tool, one methodology fits all for every soil and every compost heap. You wouldn't go into your small backyard vermiculture with a giant shovel, you'd kill your earthworm. So you need like a more tender approach in there. And so I think like, because like my background is in design as well. And so I tend to say like all of what you just showed looks like great co-design. But I think everybody on this call knows great co-design isn't what's happening everywhere all the time. And so I think if you're thinking about social imagination as something that can happen within a co-design process, they can look similar, they can involve similar tools and methodologies. But social imagination as a way of inviting people to engage in the soil necessitates a more tender and delicate and relational approach because you're cultivating soil. You're not designing an intervention where you say, now the soil fits in the sandcastle. Look at the thing that I made. Isn't it great? So I would be so curious if you could speak a little bit more, both from what you've been finding about like, what does this ask of you as practitioners to do? Like one of the things, just really briefly, like we know from Kay McKercher's work in co-design, that like community does not need to be given a voice. Community already has a voice. We just need to learn to listen. And so a lot of the stuff that I saw is like, how do you set people up to listen, especially if that worldview and that imaginary, the values are different. So if you could speak just a bit more about like, what does it ask of you when you're doing that? How do you invite people into this?
Do you want to start, Ruth?
No, you go for it.
Okay. Yeah, Ali, I absolutely agree, and I absolutely agree with what's being said in the chat, that this isn't a competition of frameworks, and this also isn't new. This has deep philosophical foundations in the Sufis, in even in sort of Neoplatonism, if we wanted to go there, which obviously we don't. But this isn't new. This is a way the conversation is bubbling up now, if you see what I mean. The word imagination, for whatever reason, is at this moment one which creates the conversation anew, and that will always be the case. It will probably shift to a different word, and that's fine too. And so yes, that kind of how do we show up? How do we do the inner work? I think the first thing is always being deeply suspicious of the social imagination I am already a part of. Like, what assumptions am I bringing about how we do things? What assumptions about productivity? You know, having that real clarity of lens on myself, and I think in very gentle steps, inviting people to kind of see the thing sideways from how they've already seen it. So even like using those pictures as a prompt that you saw in one of the exercises, that you might, well, what's the matter, you know, what's so earth-shatteringly different than that. But inviting people to check in with looking at images and selecting images about how they are and how they're showing up to a meeting massively changes the kind of connections that are in the room. Because instead I'm talking about, I'm a little bit worried about this. There happens to be a picture of a cat. I'm a little bit worried about my cat. She didn't eat her breakfast or her dinner, and I think she's unwell. And I'm actually really, what I'm thinking is, when can I take her to the vet? That's what I've showed up with today. And now we're in a different way of being together. So the methodology isn't radical at all, using images, which might have a cat in it, or even asking people to use that as a way of checking in. But what the invitation, if you like, of social imagination is how do we get to those, how do we tune in to what's needed here? Do we need to grow our way of being together, or do we need to change our way of seeing the problem at this moment, or do we need to act in a way together and learn something from our acting? So it's really, it's sort of like having a little bit of a backward stance and going, what as I hold this compass, what's going to move us into a new way of working together at this moment? Yeah.
Shall I pick up? I think, you know, it does start, you have to, I mean, it's like, this isn't special to social imagination. I think it's true in lots of these practices. You have to live it and model it yourself. So I have loved working with Hannah because we bring quite different, you know, we've got overlapping practices, but we also bring quite different practices. And there's a huge amount of challenge that goes on between the two of us. Behind the scenes. Is my Wi-Fi going a bit weird? I'm going to carry on and assume you can hear me. So even Hannah and I were on a call yesterday, just doing a bit of prep for today, and we completely, we went through all of our thinking again, because we are in a dialogue together about, well, what are we assuming, and what are we thinking, and what did we think was happening then, but was that really happening, and how did we know? And so I think that self-questioning and openness to challenge and reframe is like so key. But I wouldn't say that was special to this practice, but it's definitely key. I think, to build on what Hannah said, I think this is a dance, and it's a dance between yourselves, it's a dance with the community, and it's a dance with the existing paradigm. I don't think there are right or wrong answers. And what I think we were doing all of the time was constantly making finely tuned judgments about how much we play with the existing system and how much we keep a safe space away from it. And I think I'm somebody who's worked at a senior level in government, and I think I use that a lot to try and calibrate the level of challenge. You need the space to do the proper work in, and not to compromise the proper work. But if what we're also trying to do is to deliberately undermine the existing system, we do want to articulate with it a bit. And I think that dance is something that we judge all the time. And Hannah and I have talked a lot about times when we've pushed that too much. I think in some of our work, but you know, there was a time in a different piece of work where we tried to push the system somewhere it didn't want to go, and it didn't work. And so every intervention is worth doing, and every intervention is a learning point for us, and you know, that reflection is really key. But I love what somebody put in the chat. This is a remembering of what was. So on one level, there's nothing new here at all. And we love, you know, we're learning from all of the comments and everything that you're putting in here as well.
Thanks both. There's a few other questions that seem to be really compelling here that others are wanting to put to both of you. Question from Kate McKegg. I'd be interested to know how people's imaginations of what the future could be shifted through the process. Have I said that correctly? I'd be interested to know how people's imaginations of what the future could be shifted through the process.
What the future could be
Shifted. Yeah.
Through the process.
Shall I start by talking about the first few examples? So in the Portuguese speaking community, there had been a very stuck sense that their ill health was inevitable and that they were somehow socially bottom of the pile and would not be able to shift the persistent health and well-being challenges in their in their families and in their community. And by the end of the project, apart from individual families obviously shifting what they imagined health to be, as a community working together, the belief that they could hold the answers to their own health and well-being needs had massively shifted, and it was a massively asset-based approach. It was kind of, rather than what's wrong with these ill people, we were going in saying, what are the real strengths, and identifying that strength of the household loyalty and household commitment to one another, and the strength of the wider commitment of the community to one another, and that sense of shared identity. That became the anchor point for where can health happen, what can drive health. It's those things. It's not what the health system thinks it should be. And by supporting them to imagine their own ways of being healthy together, they became their imagination about what they could do in their community and what health could look like massively expanded. In Wales, similarly, the initial start point of young people saying it's never going to change around here shifted to them wanting to own their imaginations of the future in places and conversations of power, and changed their perspective of what it means to be part of a community and active in the change. So their imagination of what could be possible in those valleys deeply shifted. Ruth, do you want to talk to Canvey?
Well, just to give it a slightly different perspective, I think we saw a shift in the institutional imaginaries. So in a couple of our early sessions with our core leadership team, it was really clear that some people turned up with the mindset of the old system, which was, I'm a small voluntary sector organisation. I'm going to be in the room with Essex County Council, which gives out lots of money, and I'm going to use this as an opportunity to get more money for my organisation. And there's nothing wrong with organizations having their own individual plans and projects, but by the end, what some of those organizations were doing, locally based, community based, faith based, they all had their own different things, different particular niche activities, but they were coming together. And they came together in one particular idea, which was about that condemned building, the paddocks. And they started to say, what if we collectively took over this space? What might our community want from this space? And how could we do it together? So they were starting to imagine a very different way of being and doing together that really broke down those institutional rivalries that you do see quite a lot in communities vying for funding and so on.
Thanks so much. There's a really great question that's just appeared here. And I can't find it, but it has something to do with, gosh, where is it?
Is it the one that's been asked?
It's about how the institutions are shifting through the work like this. So what are some of the deeper, more profound, more ongoing shifts that you're observing in the institutions themselves as they go through these processes?
Sorry, Perry, repeat it
That's all
quickly.
right. Thank you so much for reposting your question. How much of the change stays in the institution or goes with the staff that took part in the workshops? Great question.
Shall I answer quickly from Canvey perspective? I don't know. Is the honest answer. And I think I would suspect that it varies. Inevitably, it's frustrating because we had a limited amount of time to be involved and we could only do so much. I if I was doing it again, there are many things I'd do differently, but one of the things I'd love to dial up even more is the sense of the core leadership team as leaders beyond within the work. So I think some of them were very explicitly and actively talking, they were thinking when we were all together, and they were taking that thinking away, and they were talking with other people and other colleagues and bringing that back, and there was a really rich kind of seeding of ideas and challenge in all sorts of directions. I suspect that wasn't everywhere, and it would have been really lovely to maybe have had a bit more time to think about that part of one's role in this type of work, because Hannah and I played around with so many different metaphors. There's a risk of introducing too many metaphors to try and describe this, but one of the things that I think is important is that we tried to design something whereby it didn't matter that everyone would have different starting points, and that people weren't all necessarily going to be ready to join at the beginning. So sort of in my head, it was a bit like a huge river system flowing towards the sea, where different, some people started really high up in the mountains and their little tributaries came in right at the beginning, and some people joined later, and that was fine. And the point was for everyone to be on the journey and progressing in their own self-work and their own community work at the pace that was possible for them. So I think there's the need for sort of grace to one another in it. You could try and hold the highest of ambitions, but we were just wanting to welcome more and more people in to the extent that they could be in. So I think I'd want to do more of that if we were doing it again.
I think that's right. Social imagination can be seen as, and is sometimes explained as, a kind of toolkit of imaginative stuff you can do with people to generate new ideas. And I think that's why we came in heavy on the philosophy at the beginning, because if it becomes toolkit, a sort of a toolkit or methodology based idea, essentially what happens is lots more ideas maybe get generated, but then they are just available to be picked by the same old dominant imaginary. And so increasingly, I am really looking to do work that, if we're working with an institution, there is a leadership strand alongside a community strand. I spoke before about the role of, when I work with social imagination, I'm always trying to think, how can imagination decrease the confidence of leaders that they currently know how to do things, and increase the confidence of the community that they have deep and glorious and useful knowledge and ideas to put in. And quite often funding can be for like community well-being or community dreaming or community activity, and you don't have this bit funded. Or sometimes it can be to work in an institution on some kind of stuck problem, and you don't ever get the invitation to work with the community. I also think, however, that some kind of community imagining, which is very grassroots and doesn't necessarily connect to what we might see as governance structures that can shape our world, if they grow strong enough, they will shape them. Because ultimately, the imagining ourselves as connected and interdependent parts of this cosmos is the truth, right? So even if those people aren't listening yet, or wherever, here we are rehearsing it. And if we don't build the muscle to rehearse it wherever we are, even in these tiny little pockets of opportunity, what are we up to? So even if the opportunity feels small, personally, I would rather be rehearsing the truth of that than in a more influential space where I'm keeping the same old stuff running. And so I think, the wonderful Hospicing Modernity book, somewhere in the 73-ish, I think, page, it talks about how the water of radical change is perhaps at our ankles, and until it comes up to our waists, we can't yet swim. But what are we going to be doing whilst it's rising? I'm going to be practicing my swimming strokes, I hope. At least that's my intention. So it might not stay in the institution when people leave, but have those people been practicing their swimming strokes for when the water rises high enough for us to really go, flip, we've got to change and we've got to do it fast.
Hannah, that's incredible. And I can see so many nods on the limited faces that I can see on screens, but I see hearts coming up from the bottom of the toolbar, and I see more happening in the chat. As we're coming to the conclusion of, yes, time is a construct, but we also want to be respectful of people's times and other meetings that they need to go to. I know that we had an idea asking people to connect in to their practices and what was it that drew you to this idea of social imagination. And I was wondering, Hannah, if that's something that you'd still like to invite the audience to participate in before we draw this webinar to a close.
I'm very happy to. I had somewhat forgotten about it, so let me do that now.
Great. While Hannah prepares everything needed for this very last invitation to imagine. Oh, it's there. That was fast.
It's there. Yes, I have selected some images from that photo pack that you saw some people in the Portuguese speaking community using. And my question would be, or our question is, using these images as prompts, which images speaks to what our sharing in the chat and us today inspires in you? Which image speaks to what we've talked about and we've shared in the chat today, what that inspires in you? So if you'd just like to have a little look, and then just write your answer in the chat if you'd like to, or keep it for yourself. Yeah, which image inspires, it speaks to what has inspired you this morning, yeah, afternoon and morning, and everything in between.
As the responses in the chat start to slow down and as our time rapidly approaches the hour of our closing, I would just like to invite anybody who would like to. The Center for Public Impact hosts a Slack community of practice where we'll continue conversations around these examples and more. This is a little bit more related to government and public sector work. So if that's up your alley, there are a couple people in the chat asking fantastic questions about what does this mean for NGOs or what does this mean in government. That's a question to ask in that chat, and there'll be some hot takes there, I'm sure. There'll be more examples, so if you'd like to join our Slack, you're more than welcome to. We also, if this wasn't enough for you, we have a second social imagination series coming up soon. I'll put a link to that in the chat. Again, like this session, it will be recorded and sent out to everybody who registers. And in that one, we're going to be asking, how do we support and enable social imagination at scale? So we'll be hearing from a very different panel with very different examples and having a little bit more discussion around how do we change the systems and the institutions and the conditions that this is taking place within. Although we started to get there here as well. It's almost like it's interconnected. So as everyone leaves, I'd like to say thank you so much to Hannah and Ruth. It's been a delight. It's been a pleasure. We thank you so much. Thank you for spending your time with us. We're having lots of thanks in the chats. We're having some applause from the audience.
Thank you to everyone in the chat. It's got to be one of the most lively chat sessions I've ever seen. And so glad that everybody's finding the conversation engaging. We do too. We hope we'll see you at the next sessions. Hannah and Ruth, thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.